Hey Untold Radio Network fans, want exclusive perks and to support our channel? Introducing our YouTube membership program with 3 amazing levels. Get loyalty badges that level up to different cryptids the longer you're a supporter. How cool is that? You'll also get access to custom Bigfoot emojis and priority in chat. Upgrade to Backstage Pass for exclusive wallpapers, photos, status updates, discounted books, and merchandise. Go all in with the producer level for everything mentioned plus member shoutouts. Ready for an enhanced experience? Join now, pick your membership level, and let's make this journey even more exciting together.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. Since I started doing Talking Weird before it was on the Untold Radio Network, so this is something like 3 years ago, there was a regular viewer come listener, because in the early days it was just audio, and that was my stepfather, who always watched with my mother, Gwenda, and his name was Alan Hooke. Unfortunately, he passed this week, yesterday, Sydney time anyway, and Monday, Sydney time, Monday, Sydney time, which was Sunday, American time. Anyway, it's a great loss. He was a great man, a veteran, a true believer in Christ. And one of his favorite theologians was Chuck Missler. So I'm sure he would have loved to be watching tonight's show, where Jason and I are going to go and dig deep into a wonderful lecture series by the also late Mr. Missler, and that is Angels, the Invisible War. So that's what we'll be talking about tonight on Mysterious Library.
Good evening and welcome to a special edition of the Mysterious Library. Again, in memoriam, today's episode, we very much chose today's subject in order to pay homage to Dean's stepfather, and I hope we do it justice. Before we get started, though, we do actually have a book of the week, don't we?
We do indeed. Actually, I interviewed the author Maxim Furyk as a pre-record for this Saturday night's Talking Weird, and it's an absolutely fascinating book. It's called Coal Region Hoodoo, Paranormal Tales from Inside the Pit. And Maxim looks at Philadelphia, or rather at Pennsylvania as a whole, and either uses weird tales there as jumping off points to look at more of the broader paranormal, or he comes in from outside and hones it down to a specific case in paranormal, which is pretty interesting, because most regional paranormal books seem to be very regionally focused, as this book is. But this book, like we do on this show, it puts whatever case it looks at into very solid historical and cultural context. And amongst other things in there, of course, Shaver was born in the same town Maxim was born in, Richard Shaver. So there's a whole chapter on Richard Shaver in there, which anybody who's a regular viewer or listener knows is somebody that I have particular interest in at the moment.
Yeah. Can't possibly imagine why.
And there's something as well I didn't even know about the Shepton. There was a Shepton mine accident where 3 miners were buried in Shepton, and 2 were recovered. 2 they got out. And I may have heard of it, but I'd never heard about the paranormal stories. Like the 2 men who survived both claimed to have seen a weird blue door that opened, and they had encounters with these various paranormal beings, and one of them thought that deceased pope who'd only died 10 days before, because one of them was very strong believing Catholic, came to get them through it and let them know that they were going to get out. It's a very bizarre paranormal story. And of course, the door opening inside the buried chamber they were in makes you think, well, Shaver was from Pennsylvania. If somebody told him there were 2 miners who were buried, well, only 2 got out alive, and they saw a door open and 3 friendly human but not human beings walked out, Shaver would have said that was the terror coming to help them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
a great book, and people should listen in Saturday night to that pre-record as well, because I really enjoyed talking to Maxim. He was great.
No, that's interesting. I do probably haven't talked about this a lot, but I do a lot of illustrations for Arcadia Press on the side for their eerie. Some of the eerie. I was actually one of their first sort of creepy books. I wasn't the first, but I was amongst the first sort of those. And so they've gone and done this whole other series of eerie, fill in the blank, right? The Quad Cities of Virginia, stuff like that. And it's very traditional for, these regional books to just tell the story and focus just on the event itself, and not put it into a broader perspective. Although some will absolutely do that. So but it's definitely not the norm. I'm really interested to see this because that, to say, hey, here's this event, let's put it in a broader cultural and historical perspective. That's an interesting idea, which again, we do all the time here, but you don't find them usually in that book. So I'm excited for this. I like that idea.
Yeah, you'll dig the book. I'll get you a copy so you can read it. You'll like it.
We can review it on this one. No reason.
Yeah, actually, we should. Down the track, we should do it for sure. You'll enjoy it. It's a entertaining read. It's written at, I think, almost really at an academic level, but still written very accessibly. Like there's plenty of references in there, and so he's put a lot of research into it. But it's still very readable. All the tales in there are fascinating.
Excellent. Yeah, no, I'm interested. Love to hear it. Yeah, well,
I have to thank you, Jason,
for an episode.
And I have to thank you, Jason, for suggesting that we do something when you found out about Alan's passing, my stepfather's passing, Alan Graham Hooke. And you said, well, we should do something that he liked, And you said, well, what did he like? And I said, well, he loved Chuck Missler. And we've never done Missler on the show before. So it made perfect sense to do that.
Well, let's get into it. So where do we want to start on this one? What's funny is when I started, I picked these 2 particular episodes. I figured this is where all the action would be. And the second it starts off, it's like, so this is like I think it was like part 3 or part 2. And it's like, so part 1 was the entire part 1 is about the holographic universe. And I was like, Dean's going to kill me.
Well, he still talks about it, in fairness, in he does. Particularly the 4th part. So you're right. I think this is part 3 and part 4 we're particularly reviewing. And I think there was part 1 and 2, which kicked off more into that, the kind of ideas that the famous physicist Bohm put forward about the holographic universe, and how the idea of us, what's the terminology? There's the microcosm, the macrocosm, which is the universe we know. And then there's like is it the meta? Did you say?
Yeah, metacosm. Yeah, I wrote that down because I'm like, I get it. I'm gonna have to steal that. That's a great idea.
It fits in with the things we talk about all the time about how you can look at the traditional Christian narrative that this reality that we live in, this physical reality, isn't the most important reality. And it also applies to other ideas, as far as the sci-fi type writings of the Matrix, down through Gnostic ideas and Buddhist ideas about there being higher realities. But obviously Missler is looking at this from a Christian perspective.
Yes.
And it fits perfectly. I think that's one thing that a lot of people, almost regardless of their faith today, unless they're very strong in their belief, it's so easy to get trapped in this reality by bill paying and taking care of the kids and having to work the job and commuting to work, your cubicle every day, commuting home, turning on the Netflix, that we forget most religious traditions, including what at least used to be the dominant religious tradition and kind of still is in the United States of America, Christianity, always posited that this wasn't the most important reality. There's a spiritual reality above and beyond that. And Missler does a wonderful job, not just of articulating that and putting it into the perspective of some modern physics. He also does a wonderful job of digging in to the Bible, throughout the Bible, to see the importance of spiritual warfare, and that there's another reality operating outside of time, but sometimes still based locally. It's a fascinating review of what's actually going on in the spiritual world and how it impacts the world that we find ourselves living in.
Yeah, for people who are fans of Heiser, like Missler was Heiser before Heiser was cool. Sort of is really sort of the way to look at it. I will say, like, he definitely there's a few points where I think particularly when this was recorded. So again, we're not going to even address the aesthetics, because there's zero aesthetics to this. These are literally sermons that he gave. So like, there's no aesthetics here. From the academic standpoint, there's a few points where I was like, okay, I wish he had, Heiser's work had been more prevalent prior to the recording of this, but this was like early 2000s. So a lot of Heiser's work hadn't really made it into the mainstream consumption. Just because I think there's a few things that would have worked a little bit smoother, but you can see he's right there with the idea. Like, he's already got it. This is one of those things. This is one of my main complaints when people are like, oh, you're talking about Heiser's work. Well, yeah, I do reference Heiser's work a lot. I've done everything but a friggin' ad read for the dude. But he wasn't the only one to talk about this stuff. People have talked about this stuff for centuries. In fact, Heiser's whole point, one of his main claim, or one of the main statements he made, he goes, I'm not really coming up with new material. I'm just relaying it to the layman, right? So Missler was already there. He just didn't have a few points of the archaeology that Heiser was able to pull out and really extrapolate from, like the Bulls of Bashan. There's a lot of archaeological work that's been done that was sort of released and done well after this recording that sort of lays out a lot of materials, but he's already there in these sermons. He just doesn't have that material to allow him to go, okay, let's sync it 100%. He gets you like 80-90% of the way there on a few of these points. So, but yeah, I mean, essentially, if you like Heiser, then you need to like Missler, because Missler got it well before Heiser was popular, long before he was doing his public work.
Yeah, Missler was my gateway to this, really, way back in the 1990s. Like, it was a long time ago. In fact, I think I first became cognizant of the importance of Genesis 6:1-4 in the UFO community, and how people suggested that linked to what was going to happen in the end times, which is a point that Missler makes as well. The idea of, some type of interference from perhaps Nephilim, or some type of interference within our physical beings. At a UFO conference in America, I think I met Guy Malone, the author of Come Sail Away. Guy Malone still speaks at Roswell and places like that, and I'm in contact with Guy occasionally. But he at the time was giving out pamphlets and tracts and things talking about this type of things that Heiser talks about now, and planting it very firmly within the context of UFO belief. But and Malone's book looked at that a little bit as well, if I recall, but certainly throughout the 2000s, before Heiser kind of became dominant on the scene in the last 10 years or so, or however long it is, Missler really was the guy who was leading this whole charge.
Yeah.
So it's funny when sometimes I've talked to people, Christians today, about Heiser, who are vaguely familiar with him or not quite, and they'll often say, you must read Chuck Missler as well. And I'm like, yeah, Missler's great. So he laid that groundwork in a lot of Christians' minds for how the old supernatural idea of I suppose an angelology, although obviously Heiser talks more about the Elohim and the divine council and these other things, but the idea that there's this active heavenly host and a fallen host, and there is a real spiritual war going on, and some of these, what we would think of as fallen angels, actually are like the Prince of Persia. They control geographic areas.
Yes.
And this is something that Heiser talks about as well. But again, Missler had talked about it 20 years before. So it isn't that Missler necessarily beat Heiser to the punch, because they came at it from different directions. Heiser came from it within within a kind, not so much a seminary, but in an ancient language, higher education, perspective. And
Right.
Missler came at it, I think, as somebody who was clearly a super switched on and intelligent guy, but somebody who just came in as a layman biblical scholar who did his research. And as a technologist, he was able to line it up with advances in physics and advances in, computer engineering. Like he's warning about AI back then. He's talking about AI and how it's a spiritual threat back then.
Yeah, this is one of those things that I did like that he did in this. And when you understand that he was he was an engineer, he was a computer engineer, he was a businessman, he was a scientist before he did all this. Like he made big connections, government connections. He long before he became a pastor. But like when he talks about John Keel, he points out, and this is something we don't ever really discuss. When we talk about John Keel, we sort of, it's exclusively from this perspective of a guy who's a researcher within this field. But he's like, hey, he points out John Keel was not just some random dude like me. He was, this dude worked on ARPANET. He was a computer scientist and an astronomer. He helped map Mars, for crying out loud, the surface of Mars.
Although Jacques Vallée, you mean? Sorry.
I'm sorry, Jacques Vallée. Jacques Vallée. My bad.
So you meant.
Yeah.
It's easy to get the names. They're very similar in their thinking.
Right, exactly. Sorry, that's on me. But he points that out. I mean, that when he appeals to his observations on the UFO stuff, very much he points out, like, hey, these are not the beliefs of someone A, who's a Christian, or B, someone who's just some random dude. This is someone who's of real value, who's of real pedigree, looking at this material and saying, this isn't what it claims to be. Right. As you're so fond of pointing out, belief is the enemy. In a lot of these cases, right? And so I did like how he pointed that out. And again, watching as soon as the thing started, I'm like, oh, we did start in the wrong one. But he does come back to this idea of the macroverse and sort of the holographic universe. I'm going to let you go off on that one, because I'm going to be honest, I still see it all as more of a really great metaphor for the world that we live in. But he makes some really good observations and interesting points, and I know you're a little bit more tuned in on that one, so I will let you go. I'm going to sit back and listen.
Well, I'm far from an expert. I mean, my knowledge of it probably primarily comes from reading the Michael Talbot book, The Holographic Universe, which was very popular in New Age circles around the time I was doing my PhD dissertation. So from the mid 90s to mid 2000s. And Talbot looked at the physicist Bohm, which Missler talks about, and also looked at similar developments in psychiatry that thought the brain behaved like a hologram. And people like Bohm, who was like an Einstein contemporary or protege, like he was one of the greatest physicists of all time, or Bohm, B-O-H-M, I always mispronounce his name. But how both of these guys were coming at the idea of the way we experienced reality maybe being very different to the way we thought we experienced reality. So our minds behaved more like a hologram, and reality itself, or the physical exterior world to us, the universe, behaved like a hologram. And it's worth reading that book. I think that Talbot book is, I mean, I haven't read it for probably 10, 15 years, but I remember being cognizant that it was plugging into new age ideas as well. But like anything with good data in it, you can extract the data and you mightn't like, some theory attached to it. But the basic concepts seem to make a lot of sense. And that basic concept, as Missler does, ties into this idea that there's a micro universe, a macro universe, and then a meta universe above it. And while these two things are both finite, the universe above it is infinite and is timeless. And that's the universe that really matters. And he talks about how Bohm had an expression that the bigger reality was enfolded and our one was unfolded, or something. The idea that there was something more difficult perhaps to discern, but was the true reality. And it fits in again with so many mystical, both Christian and other mystical traditions from Neoplatonism and Christianity on down. So there's something to it. And it's interesting you mentioned John Keel before, because of Keel, of course, who also, like Vallée, wasn't somebody who was a Christian.
Yeah.
But he saw similar things as well. He talked of things like the super spectrum. He talked about things like ultra-terrestrials, meaning that as a literary just device, that there was some other reality that seeped into ours, and there was a super spectrum which went beyond what we could see, and some of the things interacting with us might come down from other levels in that super spectrum and interact with us. And whether that would be an energy that just fired our brains, or whether there was actual intelligence behind it. I'm not sure if Keel was ever happy to come to an ultimate conclusion. He certainly played with lots of ideas, but again, it fits into that pattern that there's something above and beyond us that isn't accessible every day in our physical reality, but can have profound impacts on us and our physical reality.
And so, getting back to the idea of the holographic universe for just a moment, and to your point, a lot of this does harken back to a lot of earlier ideas, because my understanding of the holographic universe essentially is that our universe is actually is technically flat, and that depth, all of these things are essentially illusions of essentially how the program plays out, in the same way that a computer program is actually flat, but that it has the illusion of depth. That's actually our reality. Like I said, I've never been a big fan of it as a literal idea, but maybe as a broader metaphor. However, Missler does a great job, I think, of pointing out, it's like, hey, this is just what these physicists are pointing to, is just the same thing that the Bible's talked about for thousands of years. And again, to your point, almost everyone has said for thousands of years, this reality is a lesser copy of a higher, more real reality. Again, going back to my favorite metaphor of, we're Mario in the original 8-bit system, and that reality would be like our reality. And it's in us trying to understand them would be the same problem of Mario trying to understand us and our reality, and how we couldn't even explain our reality to him in any meaningful way beyond some very, beyond essentially metaphors contained within his reality. That's the best we'd ever be able to do. That's kind of where he's coming from. One of the things I think Missler did very well, and again, he was these are not the first people to come up with these thoughts. They are simply the ones that popularized them for the current era, right? But he very heavily addresses the Nephilim in this particular lecture series, and he doesn't just address them; he puts them within the context of demons and within the context of the modern day. The idea of them being hybridized, that they are not the fallen angels, they are the demons that we see, like at Gadara, which we've mentioned before. But then also, hey, it's entirely possible that Jesus is predicting, prophesied their return in some way at the end, and then starts pointing out, again, things we've talked about as well, how the modern transhumanist movement seems to be pushing in this world to try, in a way, to almost recreate them artificially.
Yeah, the idea of the singularity clearly is something that Missler warns about. Rightfully so. I mean, I do think that this term isn't meant to be in reference to that, but there very may well be a ghost in the machine.
Yeah.
When you start to open up networks where energy can travel through and make decisions and do things, who knows how the spiritual world can interact with that. And I think that's one of the strengths of Missler as well. I think if you're a Christian and if you believe in angels and demons and you don't have a more sophisticated context in which to explain that to a modern audience, I think you lose people and you think, oh, you're just some, not that you should have to justify your beliefs, but if you want to,
Yeah.
I think if you're just like, well, there's a spiritual war between good and evil, they're like, oh, shut up, boomer, or whatever the equivalent is, right? Like they don't want to hear that. They just think it's some old-fashioned, weird, supernatural, nutty, superstitious idea. But the reality is, when you start doing things like Missler did, when you start comparing it to high-end ideas in quantum physics, when you start applying it to what's actually going on in a technological realm, when you start looking at the Bible the same way Heiser does, as more complicated than just, oh, well, the demons are the fallen angels. And it's like, well, no, the demons aren't the fallen angels. The fallen angels seem to be the fallen angels. They seem to be things that have often, like the Prince of Persia and Daniel, often seem to have been given. So this comes back to something else Heiser talked about frequently, was the gods of the nations. It seems that some of these entities were given permission by God to control certain areas, and those areas are even hard for God's angels to get through. Yeah. And he makes the point about the Prince of Persia when the angel, whoever it is bringing the message to Daniel, he gets caught fighting the Prince of Persia, and he has to call on Michael, the archangel, who's probably the most powerful angel of all, to come to help him. And then Michael has to do battle there as well. So if there is this higher spiritual reality, but somehow God, as the Bible suggests, and not a whole lot of Christians talk about it anymore, Heiser does, Missler does, gave parts of this world the authority over to these gods of the nations, who ultimately were part of probably the fallen host, because it seems like they did the wrong thing, then those authorities still stand. And we won't go into the details, but you were talking to me the other day, last night, in fact, about the importance of spiritual authority and how it is part of this cosmic pattern. And it's not something which I think the modern church hardly addresses at all anymore.
Yeah. I mean, this is one of those things that Missler really was on the cutting edge of for this newer age. In many ways, you could argue he was a counter to he was a reaction to the satanic panic of the 80s in a lot of ways. I think it's probably a way to putting things in context. That may be a better way to put it into context, because for those who maybe missed it or wasn't really up on it, in the 80s, there was this big satanic panic, right? And people were it became very mainstream. People talking about, heavy metal bands using Halloween decorations, all these things, right? And they were always painted as these crazy nut jobs. And often the people who would be put on the screen would be Cletus, right? Because again, we don't have a media. We have propaganda. And so they would find the loudest, most ignorant people to put up instead of the people who really had done this, and say, hey, hold on, there's some reality to the spiritual stuff. Now, of course, it was always presented as, well, we know that the supernatural isn't real. So this guy's concerns about Dungeons and Dragons or, Kiss or whatever is completely ludicrous. And of course, they would put up the most ludicrous people. But in a lot of ways, Missler is that response, saying, hold up. You're basing all this on the idea that this stuff isn't real, but physicists are giving us an argument that maybe this stuff is real. We have evidence for it to be real. And if it is real, then we should probably pay a little bit more attention to it and stop making certain assumptions. And he would give the argument for it. In fact, I think it's in the second one that we reference, right? He does point out, and he kind of starts with the whole UFO thing, and he points out, hey, no Christian's ever been abducted. We don't have an account of. I've even written about this. We don't have a case of a Christian ever being abducted. We do have cases of people who went to church like on Christmas, right? Like they were culturally Christian, yes. We don't have accounts of people who were spirit-filled, believers ever being abducted by aliens. He points out a particular case. I thought I wrote it down, and I may not have it here. I thought I wrote it down because it was an interesting one. Okay, we'll move on. But he points out this one particular case, to which Missler goes in and investigates, because she was an active Christian. But he points out she wasn't abducted. She was invited, and she accepted the invitation. Now, for y'all longtime listeners, you know, we've talked about this in response to the Fae and the elves, particularly, you know, when we did the Irish folklores of the people, you know, the good neighbors. You don't do that. You find some way to be very polite, but don't go with them. Why? To Missler's whole point, and a lot of this is, if they extend an invitation, this goes back to the idea of authority, then your protection is gone because you put yourself in that situation. There may be things they can't do to you per se as a Christian, but you were invited, you accepted, you put yourself in that situation. This is a theme, again, not to get too far afield, that we actually see a lot of people talking about. It's like, well, why do certain people say certain things and do certain things in certain ways? And they'll talk about karmic retribution, that a lot of these dark occultists with ill intent will essentially make it kind of obvious and deny it, but they'll make it obvious. So it's like, well, yeah, but you did it knowingly. It was clear. I mean, look at all the satanic material around it. Look at all these things. You knew this was bad for you, but you did it anyway, so it's not my fault. You just didn't believe it was bad. And that's a big point that Missler sort of, particularly that wraps up in the second one, saying, hey, you can't be passive in this world. The spiritual world is not just, it's not just that it's a thing. It's a thing and it's active. And you have to be actively engaged to protect yourself from it, because it is looking for you. It wants to engage with you through things like transhumanism and direct occultism hidden as other things. But it is looking to engage in you directly. You have to actively oppose it.
And I think that's the strength of John Keel that I know Missler has talked about in the past as well. Again, Keel wasn't a Christian, but he was also very cognizant that if you engaged with this stuff, bad things would probably happen. In fact, his advice to people who were haunted by poltergeists or aliens or anything else was, if you have any occult books in your house, if you have any UFO files, if you have any UFO books, get rid of them all. Close those doorways. Keel made the point that Albert Bender, the person whom the official Three Men in Black story starts with, even though you can see the Men in Black appearing in Maury Island years before that. But that story first starts with somebody, not only does he run a UFO fanzine essentially at the time in a saucer club, he also has his room was filled with all kinds of, you know, dark imagery and occult imagery and horror imagery, and the distinctions between those two worlds, which most standard UFO believers who think it's nuts and bolts and coming from Zeta Reticula or Mars or wherever the planet of the week might reside in ufology, they don't understand that there's a connection to something deeper and spiritual and deceiving. And it's interesting that people like Jacques Vallée and John Keel, who I consider are two of the preeminent thinkers in this field in all of history, without even being Christians, saw that there's something going on here where you're being lied to and it's dangerous and be very careful. But Missler, of course, is able to articulate that within the context of a traditional Christian understanding of a Bible. And when I say traditional Christian understanding of a Bible, I don't mean what you're probably going to get at 90+% of churches at the moment, or 90% of Bible studies at the moment, because these type of things aren't looked at. But somebody who's properly well versed and wants to understand the entire Bible can't escape this holographic type reality, this reality of a higher spiritual dimension that interacts with us all the time. And you have to be careful how you engage with aspects of that world, because a lot of them, as Missler says, I think he says, you use both as a puppet and you're a prize in this spiritual war.
That's a great line. That was a great line that he used, because you're both puppet and prize. Particularly when you get into the transhumanist idea, right? This idea of sort of recreating the Nephilim, but then he also basically presents an idea that a lot of people have discussed, and even ufologists, again, non-Christian ufologists have discussed, the idea of allowing these things to enter our reality through our technology and giving them full access. Like Missler was very much on that cutting edge of thought, saying, hey, we're looking essentially at being able to create these artificial bodies that they can step into and interact with our reality without having to worry about the problems of an organic shell, right? For those of us who have had to deal with exorcism and dealt with other exorcists, there is this very common observation, which is that people who are legit, not just demonically oppressed or influenced, but people who are genuinely possessed, they come off as essentially crazy, very much insane. And a lot of us have sort of noticed and made the observation that what's happening, it's not just that the creatures themselves are probably a little mentally deranged, but rather that there is a conflict between the person, the native soul, and the demon itself. Because you can kind of tell sometimes, like, there's sort of like it's 50-50. Sometimes it's the person. He's like, I don't know what's going on. And then it's very clearly the demon. And he sort of points out, but with this new technology, there's the possibility of creating bodies that have no native soul for these things to contend with. And that one of the inherent dangers of all of this technology is giving them free access to us. Like you said, creating a technology that has a ghost in the shell that may be more than just a wild anomaly. Because even the idea of the ghost in the shell, or the ghost of the machine, sorry, Ghost in the Shell is the comic or the manga, which was really good. But the ghost in the machine, right? The reason that phrase even existed was early programmers noticed that every once in a while computers would just do something and they have no idea why. There was this experiment run years ago, and it's one of those things that made me question a lot of things about how we understand computers. The best programmers in the world will say computers will make decisions that they weren't programmed to do, and we need to understand that. But they ran this experiment with these little, essentially Roombas, right? They were, that with like little claws attached to them, and they put like a hockey puck in the middle of this floor, right? And they put, these machines out there in different distances. For all intents and purposes, they're identical, right? So they run the experiment. They're expecting the closest one to get there first, get the hockey puck, because that's what they're programmed to get. And then everything shuts down because they can't get the hockey puck. That's what they're expecting. That is not what happened. Because the other machines, they're like, well, we need to get the hockey puck. They weren't programmed to do this. They start fighting over the puck. And they started noticing some of the other machines would do things like wait for the puck to get loose because the two were fighting, and then swoop in and steal it. And it freaked them out because they're like, we didn't program any of this behavior in there. If you've ever been working on a computer and all of a sudden just kind of was, whatever, I'm done, and shuts down or freaks out. Nope. Sometimes it's known, other times it's not. I've talked to people who are experts in this. I am not an expert at computers, but they'll say, 9 times out of 10, we know what's happening. The problem is every once in a while, it does behave like something else is happening. Like the computer is thinking about things in a very different way. So the idea that it's possible that the more sophisticated our technology becomes, the more access these things have, these non-corporeal entities have to our reality. He was one of the first people to talk about this openly and say, we need to be giving these things, these ideas, more credence and concern than we currently are.
It's interesting that there are apps today, for example, phone apps, which are designed to supposedly facilitate communication from the spirit world. And when I first heard about these, I'll be honest, I thought this is just somebody with some random generating program. What nonsense,
Right.
And then I was talking to, I think it was Nathan Isaac, who does a wonderful Penny Royal podcast. I had him on Talking Weird, I don't know, a few months ago, because I'd seen him do a show on the connection, do an actual lecture at the Strange Realities conference. I wasn't there in person, but I bought an online ticket, talking about how there has always been this connection with technology and communication with the dead. So as soon as we started having things like radio or telegram, or and then go through the telephone, through the TV, through whatever, tape recorders, it seemed that there was something else out there that was able to somehow talk to us or send messages to us through this. And this is one of the reasons, of course, ghost hunters have things like spirit boxes. And I've always been kind of suspicious of those, which are meant to cycle through different, radio frequencies or whatever and pull out words. But talking to Nathan, I was quite conscious of maybe this isn't such a silly idea. Maybe the same way that they would have just have used a medium's hand once to do automatic writing, or maybe the way they would have got into a shaman's head to, speak some type of prophecy. Because this reality, if what we're talking about, if what everybody from physicists through Keel, Vallée to Christian theologians, if there is a reality which is higher than ours, and if we're somehow subservient, it makes total sense that they would be able to take advantage of whatever communication communication capabilities physically existed in this world. So the same way they could, if you accept that they might be able to use somebody's mouth. Jason's picked up his dog on his lap. Hello, buddy.
Yes, she decided that she needed to be.
Oh, hello, baby.
Yes, she needed to come hang out with me. She does not like being on camera, though. It's like, why are you coming in here? You know I'm on camera.
I'm camera shy.
Yeah, she's very camera shy, but she wants to be in here. But who doesn't use apps? My dog. My dog knows better than to use apps.
Well, that's probably pretty smart. But my point is that it makes sense of the type of reality that Missler's putting forward and articulating in a way that it's above ours, and technology is somehow able to be manipulated by this higher reality. Then it makes total sense that throughout the years, just like Nathan Isaac was saying, there's this history of people communicating with the other world through technology. And that's frightening. In some ways, that's creepier even than somebody rolling their eyes back in their head and speaking in some, disjointed voice. Like the idea of it punching into us through our technology.
Yeah. This is something that I've talked about a lot on my channel, which is the connection between the occult and high technology. And this is not these are not random connections. There is, when you see people, again, like Jack Parsons, right? The guy who created the JPL, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and he's talking about conjuring the devil in his home, and it's like, oh, well, that's it's not a one-off thing. And it's still prevalent today. We see them like, oh, these weird rituals that are happening over at the Super Hadron Collider. That's CERN. That's all for play. What do you mean for play? What does that have? Why does any of this have to do? There has always, again, the Nazis, they were deeply into the occult, and they were the leading scientists of the day. There's a long-standing connection between the occult and technology, particularly high technology. It's not a coincidence. And when you stop thinking about it for 2 seconds, you realize, hold on, our brain runs off of electricity. People have said for decades, the brain is simply the most advanced computer on the planet. That's all it is. And let's take the holographic universe, the non-localized phenomena that reality may be, that have been discussed, right? Both by Missler and a lot of other people. If the soul is a non-localized phenomena that exists outside of our time and space, but essentially is locked into us and is communicating through this lovely visage, what is the difference between this and that is running off of chemicals and electricity and your laptop? There really isn't. It's just your laptop doesn't have the RAM. So it's not a huge, there's not a huge distance to jump there from saying, okay, well, thousands of years ago, it was some oracle who'd breathe in toxic fumes or imbibe in some hallucinogenic drugs in order to allow these things better. And again, giving these creatures access to them. It's not that far a jump to say, well, hold on, we now have technology that duplicates all of this. And so now they've got unrestricted access to us through these materials. And this is where things do get creepy with the whole app thing. If we can essentially invite them to us by activating an app, like this thing all happens, but this whole lecture is happening before apps were even invented on smartphones. In fact, I think this, if I recall, this happened. This was recorded before the iPhone was even the smartphone was popularized. It is entirely possible that we are opening ourselves up to an entire reality that we don't really understand at all, and it's wearing a happy-go-lucky electronic mask. That this thing is just an electronic mask for a demon to use, so that we're like, oh no, it's fine. It's a funny app thing, and it's like, no, the app is what this thing is using. You're not talking to an algorithm. You're talking to an actual demon, but you'll never know the difference.
Yeah, and it's painted as all accessible and friendly, and you download it and it's just something else. And well, I'm using technology as, some kind of, go between, but I think it's dangerous. Again, whenever you open any door, are you sure you can close that door when you start inviting things in?
Exactly. Because again, this is like, I tend to think of a lot of things in, because I'm an escrow officer. I do title work. I tend to think in those lanes, right? Because it's my daily grind. If you invite someone onto your property, you kind of lose a degree of control over that. You just do. And that is, in fact, I was talking to, and again, artwork also. So, intellectual property. I was talking to a friend today. He's like, well, XYZ. And I'm like, okay, well, this is your situation. You're fine. And I'm like, well, hold on. But this other guy you're talking about, did you sign anything? And he goes, well, he kind of did use this material on another podcast. I'm like, okay, well, now we got a problem. Because you gave that material to him. Now you don't have a written contract. That's one thing. But you create a huge gray area here because you handed him that material. This is something that happens all the time in the art world. In fact, Stan Lee should be and Jack Kirby should have been billionaires by the time they were, they passed away. But they were doing work for hire. One of the reasons that Marvel and DC use the old artwork, your Swans and your Kirbys and your Bushimas, is because all of that stuff was done under work for hire. Marvel owns it exclusively. DC owns it exclusively. They don't have to pay the estates of those artists anything for that material. The newer stuff they do. That's why. It's not just because, yes, Kirby was the man. Not because John Buscema was the man. They were. Or, Swan for Superman was the man. All that's absolutely 120% true. But it's also free for them to use, so it's entirely profit for them. Because the artists voluntarily gave up the rights because they got paid. And now the rights are gone. In the same way, if we invite these things into our lives, and this is Missler's whole point, if we invite these things into our lives, we kind of give up some things. We give up certain rights and protections because you've voluntarily done things. I go back to the one case of this of a Christian that was actually abducted. Well, but she wasn't abducted. She volunteered. She accepted an invitation, which no one would have done 150 years ago, right? When we talked about these things and we had protocols for this. I was talking to a friend of mine the other day. He was shocked to find out that there used to be cultural protocols on how to deal with the supernatural. He was shocked to find out that people knew not to go with the elves, right? Not to eat their food, not to go, oh, hey, I hear a friend in the woods. Let me go wander off into it. Right. And he was shocked to find out that there was protocols for this. People knew not to do these things. And today we're all like, yeah, sure. I'll go wander off into the woods alone because I hear someone calling. I don't want to not do that. Right. And again, I go back to, we talk about in the case of the woods, how often is this happening in a city or in some urban or suburban area? And this is why these people are going missing, right? Because we don't even believe this stuff is real. We don't believe that there is a metacosmos, right? Or a metacosm. We don't believe that's a reality. We don't think this stuff interacts with us. And so we've just said, oh, that's all superstition. Because we're advanced. We've got smartphones and I can order pizza on it. And therefore I am superior in all of my knowledge and ways to our ancestors who knew that this stuff was real.
Now, I know he didn't mean this when he wrote the famous phrase, but Marshall McLuhan, the Canadian academic who dealt in, communication theory, said the medium is the message, right? Mm-hmm. The great irony today, of course, is traditional occultism has always understood the potency of mirrors, and supposedly black mirrors are particularly potent.
Yeah.
But what you were looking at then in your hand is a black mirror.
Yeah.
What most people have in their bedrooms facing their bed at night is a flat screen TV, which is a black mirror.
Yeah.
And then add to that you put the type of programming on. I don't forget about any type of morality, although we could certainly go there, but this probably isn't the show for it. But when you look at the paranormal information that has been broadcast through that medium, think back in the 50s when it all started. It was all wholesome family, leave it to Beaver and Father Knows Best. Now you turn on a show and it seems like it's great entertainment. I mean, they're fun ghost hunting shows, right? Paranormal type shows. Mm-hmm. And this is something else we were talking about, I think, the other day. I was certainly talking about it with another friend as well. But a kid watches that show, right? And then when I say a kid, a teenager, 20-something, whatever.
Yeah.
And they go, this looks just like it's fun. We'll go out and hunt ghosts and we'll talk to spirits. And how many people in all these paranormal groups that have blown up around this country and the world are because of shows like Ghost Adventurers or whatever the hell it's called. All of those type of shows, all of those ghost hunting shows, which have been going now for I don't know how long, 20 years or something. They probably become more popular in the last 10, have encouraged everybody who thinks they can buy a handy cam with a night vision kind of feature and get some EVP meter and they can go out and play Scooby-Doo. Yeah. But what they're really doing is communicating with the spirit world. They have no understanding, like you were talking about. Traditionally, people were taught, don't mess with the spirit world, don't mess with the elves and the fairies. You don't know what you're going to be, summoning or what the ramifications are going to be. And now we have black mirrors all around our house. People get in the paranormal because they're watching shows through that medium, which tells them this is fun activity you can do with your friends on a weekend. Go and talk to the spirits. Yeah. Who on earth? And now we've had this problem culturally before as well. Of course, in the 19th century, there was a big boom in seances and it was a kind of parlor game. So this isn't new perhaps to now, that communicative thing. But even that was dangerous. People then should have known better because people then were better churched probably than they are now. But now nobody's properly churched in any of this. And nobody has even the great folk warnings, which was part of the fairy faith, what you did and didn't do. So now people go, I'm going to get a camera, get 5 of my mates and get, a tape recorder. And we're going to go into that old haunted house down the road and we're going to start talking to things. Yeah. And trying to work out what it is. How do you know what it is? I mean, this is a ridiculous thing. You would have to be so naive to think you were talking to a spirit and it was telling you the truth when you have no idea what it is. No possible way of knowing what it is. Oh, but it's really this person who this has happened to. And I've never understood ever the assumption that when you're talking to something which is non-corporeal or of the spiritual world, why you assume that thing's telling you the truth.
Yeah. No, exactly. This is something I've talked about a lot is people say, oh, well, I talk to these things, so I know what it is, right? Whether it's someone who claims to speak to a Bigfoot. I'm not saying they're not speaking to nothing. Like that's where a lot of people are like, oh, so you don't think mind speak is real? I didn't say that. I never said that at all. I think sometimes, some of these cases you kind of look at and you're like, okay, but the real ones. My problem is, how do you know what you're actually talking to? And they're like, well, it said it's a Bigfoot. I need you to walk that through a few steps for me. How do they know what we call them? How do they know what these things are? Like, just ask yourself some questions. It's like we assume, oh, well, it's a supernatural being, or it's a whatever, or it's a Bigfoot. Clearly, they wouldn't lie to me. Why? Some dude rode up in a white panel van that had free candy scrawled on it. We'd all get our guns out. Because like, no, kids, don't talk to that dude. He clearly has ill intent. We have the supernatural equivalent of a dude in a white panel van except it's got Sasquatch scrawled on it, or UFOs scrawled on it, or, Bloody Mary, whatever scrawled on it. And everyone's running around like, yeah, no, seems legit. Right?
Absolutely. It's
so
crazy.
Yeah, in many ways, Missler was a response to the response to the satanic panic, saying, no, there's more here going on. And that's what a lot of this was about, was putting these things into that broader perspective, saying, hey, here's how the Christian worldview would view these things, and here's why. One thing before we go, I do want to talk about, because, and I want to talk to you about it specifically, because I heard him like, oh, they got Chuck. And then he said something. I'm like, okay, hold on. I'm back in the game now. He talks about Majestic 12 in this. And we've talked about it. And as soon as he starts talking about it, I'm like, oh, they got Chuck on this. And then he explains what Majestic 12, and then he points out, and anyone either you don't know about it or that it's false, right? He comes out and says, no, this was a hoax. But then he says something really, really interesting. And the reason it stood out is because I've talked a lot about this same tactic on my show on other things, right? Which is, he says, again, we have to remember, this is a dude who literally worked with military contracts. He worked with the military and intelligence agencies. So he knows what he's about to say when he says this. He goes, it's common for intelligence operations to give you something that is fake, but fundamentally true. So when the fake parts are discredited, the whole theory is discredited. I've talked about that a lot on our show, or on my show on the other channels, because that's literally what happens. We see it. I mean, we can literally see it happening 100 times over the last 5 years, and where they're not even trying to hide this stuff anymore. And so when he said that, it was like, yes, were the MJ-12 documents faked? Yes. Does that mean that something like the MJ-12 program didn't exist? Maybe just under a different name. He goes, I think it does. Now, I will say this. That's a really solid argument. That is a really solid argument as to why, again, because we've talked about on this channel. Why is the UFO thing a big deal? Well, it's how they cover up XYZ, right? That's not a bad point about the MJ-12 documents.
Yeah, and I think, ironically, of course, Heiser later makes similar points about the Air Force's attempts to throw out such ridiculous interpretations about Roswell, like it was crash test dummies 5 years later, and there was time compression, so the people in the 40s somehow didn't see gray bodies. They were really seeing they were really seeing crash dummies like several years later. And anybody who hears that goes, that just sounds like a ridiculous explanation. You must be doing a cover-up. So sometimes the point of the cover up might be to make people believe the opposite anyway. And in regards to
Mm-hmm.
MJ12, similar things I certainly think of as the popularization of Area 51 as a secret UFO testing base,
Yeah.
because it is a secret testing base, all right. And of
Yep.
course, I understand why those things exist. But if you throw up the smoke screen that it's UFOs, then people, oh, I saw
Mhm.
this, wonderful technology. It's, it's the ETs. And
Yeah.
it could be, again, we don't know whether it's to trick us, if it's to trick the Soviets, if it's to test if there's a mole in the operation. There could be 100 different reasons some
Yeah.
of these.
All of the above.
Exactly. Some of these things are spun. So I think Missler had a fairly solid understanding of how these things operated, as did Heiser. They're
Mhm.
they were both giants who are gone in their fields now, but both of them were conscious that sometimes you can look at what's said and you can see maybe this isn't the truth, but maybe by looking what's been
Mhm.
told to me, I can try to work out what the truth really is. Maybe by looking at the
Mhm.
whistleblower or the psyop or the false revelation or the
Yes.
disinfo or whatever it is, maybe that can point me. And maybe it can't. I mean, I think it's quite difficult to work out sometimes the
Mhm.
motivation. Even when I think this is a lie, I'm more comfortable saying this is bogus than being able to decide why we were given that bogus
Yeah.
information. But I do think there's a point to that. I do think there's a point that maybe somehow you can look at it and work out what was the intention.
Mhm.
I just find that harder to do. I think that takes a little more
Yeah.
guesswork than just going, well, this is bogus.
Mhm.
When you get into an analysis of what the real intention for it is, it becomes a bit harder.
No, I completely agree with that. It's like, you're reading between lines that you don't know where the lines are, but he had a great point. I was like, okay. It's like when he started talking about it, I'm like, they got Chuck. Then he's like, but we know that it's faked. I'm like, oh, cool. We're good. Okay. Then why are we talking? Are you just talking about this because you're talking to people who maybe aren't all up with this? And then he throws that out and I'm like, you know what? That makes a lot of sense. And it's completely consistent with how we see how things operate. So I was surprised. I shouldn't have been as surprised because it is Chuck, for him to have such a great observation. But it was I wanted to hit that one. Like I have a whole page. Hold on, my thing fell. I have a whole page of stuff we haven't even gotten to.
Wow.
On this that he talked about in this that is all material that it was really great to listen to. So again, and these are just two of a series of him. Again, Chuck Missler was a giant. He had a lot of he was thinking about things a lot of people weren't, and before a lot of people were. So his work is always interesting. And again, take the work of Missler, take the work of Heiser. Heiser was filling in gaps that clearly Missler had, although Missler was making the connections. They're there. He just didn't have that full, Deuteronomy 32, the one we have, is incorrect, right? It's an incorrect understanding of it, how to really cinch together the divine council ideology or thought forms. And the thing is, it's there in what Missler's talking about. It just isn't as fully developed as Heiser would be able to do that with his work in archaeology. But it is worth, again, he's worth looking into. And again, this was a real treat. I'm gonna go ahead and put your the image back up if you want to say a few last few things before we say goodnight.
Well, I'd like to say that Alan was clearly conscious of the type of things we're talking about. He was very aware that there was a real spiritual war. He understood the importance of understanding that there's a spiritual reality above and beyond this. And he'll be greatly missed. And it's only been for the last few weeks when he was in hospital that he hasn't watched every show I've ever done. But I hope wherever he is now, in heaven, I believe, he is somehow able to tune in and see that we did a dedication show for him, because I know he would have appreciated it and I know he would have loved this episode. Bye.